Liam, who's best girl?
Yuri.
What was that?
Natsuki.
That's what I thought.
Now, right from the get-go, you're probably making a couple of assumptions, based upon the characters, what they're like, the story, the premise, the overall tone of this game. And all of those assumptions are fair, however, this isn't how the game greets you. In fact, the first thing you see when you launch the game is this. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, hold on, that doesn't add up. And it's that exact line of thinking that has contributed so heavily to Doki Doki's recent success and exposure. However, it's that exact line of thinking that also lends Doki Doki to being more meaningful and in-depth than most people give it credit for. Often, most videos you'll find on YouTube are simply of Doki Doki walkthroughs, playthroughs, live stream highlights, etc., with a few video essays and commentaries being sprinkled through, most of them being pretty solid and entertaining. However, I thought it was time that I be the change that I want to see in the world, and carve my own little slice into this Doki Doki panic that seems to be going on. Now, this video won't necessarily be a video essay on any particular form, such as Doki Doki and why it's so scary, or whatever it might be. Instead, this video will be a bit more freeform. Just a little room for me to discuss the things that I think are so effective in Doki Doki and why I think Doki Doki is worth talking about in a more meaningful light than simply, it's scary or it's interesting. Because I think that there is real depth to be found in Doki Doki if we just dig a little deeper for it and search for it. So if it helps you digest this video a bit better, do not treat this as a video essay with any sort of focus, although there will be a major focus on the concept of subversion, which we will get into later. Instead, treat it more so like, well, exactly what the title says it is. A love letter to Doki Doki Literature Club. My own thoughts and why I think this game is so brilliant. Now, if you haven't played Doki Doki, I suggest you stop the video and go play it, or if you have any inclination to, that is. Doki Doki is worth your time, is only about 4 to 5 hours in length, and is best experienced completely blind, or as blind as possible, as the game thrives off taking you to unexpected places. Alright, now I'll assume, moving forward, that everyone watching the video has played Doki Doki to its entirety, or doesn't really have any desire to. In which case, let's just sit back, relax a little bit, maybe make yourself a cup of tea, because we have a lot of ground to cover, and allow me to explain to the best of my ability why I love Doki Doki's Literature Club. First, I think it's important to get some groundwork out of the way. Doki Doki's Literature Club is a visual novel created by Dan Salvato. Now, the first thing we need to tackle, and that is, what is a visual novel? And for some of you, you may already know, but for those of you that don't, or aren't super familiar, there are some important concepts with visual novels we have to discuss and cover, so that later on we can better explain how Doki Doki uses those concepts and subverts them to create more effective narratives and scares. A visual novel is an interactive story, essentially. The visual aspect being from the pictures, usually of characters in backgrounds, setting the scene that the story will take place within. The novel part of the visual novel is the bulk of the game, usually the text at the bottom of the screen that you click to progress through and let the story unfold. Visual novels are usually limited in player input, typically consisting only of clicking to progress the text to its next line, or clicking to save, load, etc. However, there is a little bit of player interactivity in most visual novels in the form of choices. A player will sometimes be prompted with a choice between a set amount of options, each option leading them down a certain route of the story. Therefore, most visual novels allow the player to take control of the story, usually, not always, but usually leading them down one particular love interest's route in the game. Again, this isn't always. Some visual novels do exist that don't have choices and progress linearly. Those are called kinetic novels, but we're discussing visual novels. Just know that those exist, and they're just as worthwhile. Now, visual novels also contain many endings, usually consisting of good ends and bad ends, with bad ends being typically considered game over screens, and good ends being considered canon ways to end the story, usually resulting in something favorable for the player that's grown attached to the story and its characters. Now, depending on what route you take and what decisions you make within that route, you will be led down towards the path of a good end or a bad end. Here's a visual aid to help you sort of understand this concept, where different decisions will branch you up, down, left, right, however you want to view it, towards different routes, leading you towards a certain end. Usually the player striving for a good end, as a bad end is, again, kind of a game over screen of sorts. And yes, I did model this off of the Shadow the Hedgehog level selector. It's just a really convenient way to look at it. Now, aside from decision making and routes, player input is also found in the form of saving and loading. Saving at any particular moment, typically before a big decision is made, and loading back to that moment in case you want to revisit it, review it, or revise your decision. Most visual novels also have a history option, allowing you to read back a select amount of text that you have passed previously, just in case you may have accidentally skipped over a line or wanted to read back something when making a decision. Another important feature is the skip option, which allows players to skip through text they've already seen, or by manipulating the settings, skip through all text if they have, say, played the game previously and just want to skip ahead to a point that they want to see, or have played a route already and want to skip ahead to the decision and so they can make an alternate decision, seeing where that leads them. Now, I know this is all basic stuff, but this is all stuff that Doki Doki Literature Club uses to its full extent. And that's why I need it to be clear that these things are typical expectations within visual novels. Usually they function as intended, don't really stray too far from what is expected by the player, and are simply there to be used as tools to get the best experience out of the game for the player. However, Doki Doki's Literature Club does use these tools to not just get the best experience out of the player, but to screw with the mind of the player and create more effective scenarios and scares. We will cover that later in the video, but for now, let's jump into the bulk of Doki Doki Literature Club, the story, beginning with the first part, Part A as I will describe it as. Now, Doki Doki is sort of mentally separated by two parts. There's the part of Doki Doki which takes place before Sayuri's suicide. By the way, did I mention there'd be spoilers in this? I did. Part B takes place after Sayuri's suicide. I believe I've heard it referred to by fans as the Dissenting Madness section of the game, but I don't know. Maybe that's just a catchy little name. I like it though. I'm going to be referring to them as Part A and Part B though, just for the sake of this video. Now, within Part A, the bulk of the content is typical visual novel fare. You get accustomed to the characters, you go through the story, everything is fairly typical, nothing out of the norm of what you would expect from a visual novel beyond some pretty in-depth character writing and unexpected turns. But nothing that really shouts or warrants that strange label at the beginning of the game, warning players with anxiety or depression that this might have some triggering content. I mean, beyond some minor hints towards parental abuse and maybe some self-harm, there isn't really anything explicitly shown that would warrant that. This part of the game is essentially meant to accustom you to your characters, your surrounding, the world that you're within, give you a launching point for the insanity that will happen later, as good horror needs to be grounded in something realistic. The game spends almost its first 2 hours, sometimes more depending on how quick of a reader you are, simply letting you feel where you are. Letting you feel for the characters, letting you grow accustomed to them, accustomed to your time within the literature club, and start to feel minor progression inch forward, leading you to believe that this game is going to lead you down a more romantic, subtle plot than all of these headlines praising it as a horror release would lead you to believe. It lulls you into a false sense of security, even though you've been so prepared for what this game will hold, based upon many headlines you see just launching the game on Steam and the exuberant amount of trigger warnings that the game comes equipped with. It's because of this and the total nature of Part B and how amazingly unique it is, that leads most people to discuss almost exclusively Part B and everything that ensues post Sayuri's suicide, and I do understand why. It's very entertaining stuff and fits very well in a live stream let's play sort of format because it catches the viewer and the player off guard and takes them to locations they never thought they would be narratively. However, I think that's not really fair to Doki Doki Literature Club. As Dan Salvado pointed out on his Twitter, saying that Doki Doki's Literature Club is a horror game does not ruin the impact of the game, because if it did, it would insinuate that Doki Doki's Literature Club is a flat, generic, one-dimensional game that relies on catching the viewer off guard. And Dan Salvado knows that he did not make that kind of game. I believe that Part A is just as rich, meaningful, and interesting as Part B is, even if Part A is a bit more typical. However, it's not entirely generic, as some would leave you to believe. In Part A, we get some extremely interesting foreshadowing as to what will come, and some extremely interesting character dynamics, as well as some great character progression that all works so well because of what is established within the first section of Part A. The first section of Part A works almost like a parody of visual novels, introducing many of the tropes that people accustomed to these games have come to expect. The bumbling fool childhood friend who's always late and overly optimistic for seemingly no reason, the aggressive tsundere lolly character, the quiet beauty, and of course the popular girl. These are all tropes that are so apparent in visual novels, and whereas some visual novels have subverted these tropes to great effects, such as Michiru's character from Griseia no Kaijutsu, this game uses them as a tool more so than something to later subvert, as establishing these characters so grounded within their tropes and their generic characterization makes all of the reveals later on towards the ending of Part A and the beginning to middle sections of Part B all the more effective. For example, let's focus on my personal choice for the best girl in the story, Natsuki. Natsuki begins as a typical lolly tsundere character, flip-flopping between angry, over-confrontational, and shyly, meekly spitting out their true feelings, something anyone accustomed to anime or visual novels at all will probably be familiar with. However, her character doesn't remain like this for very long. As you follow her route, you begin to peel back those layers and see that behind this very confrontational attitude that she puts on, there's an extremely meek and vulnerable girl underneath, for reasons that aren't too typical to this genre. Whereas the typical characterization for tsunderes is that they act so aggressive to cover up how soft they are on the inside, Natsuki acts like this because she has to. It's a survival tactic for her because of her past. Her first year in high school has led her to be ridiculed and undermined for her writing style and what she values in her literature. She's made fun of for enjoying manga because it's seen as childish and simplistic, and her poetry she has no confidence in due to the same reasons. Natsuki's main internal quarrel is one of value. The idea that because something is presented in a simple way, it loses its value is something that Natsuki pushes against actively, but because of how hard the world has pushed back, she's lost faith in herself, and she's lost confidence in her own writing. This is not only an interesting internal struggle simply because it demonstrates Natsuki's own hurdles which she must pass in her life, but because it says something about how the people around her, including the other characters, view literature, and more broadly, how people as a whole view literature. Natsuki's argument is not invalid. The idea that literature must be complicated, must use bigger, more exuberant words in order to get across its meaning is not always correct. In fact, this struggle is shown pretty literally through a later confrontation between Yuri and Natsuki, both representing equal ends of the spectrum. Yuri towards the side of complicated, meaningful, deep literature that uses larger words and alludes much less clearly to its true meaning, that makes the viewer dig deeper to get to the core of what is trying to be said, whereas Natsuki values more so simple, effective writing, using as little words as possible to cut away the fat and get straight to the point so that it can more effectively hit the reader, as well as being just as accessible without cutting anyone out. What is expected of visual novels of this nature usually isn't this. It's clear by how the game presents its characters, its scenarios, and its overall tone that this is intended to be a mock-up of dating simulator games. Games that focus almost exclusively on the relationship between the protagonist and their chosen love interest. Whereas some visual novels such as Steins Gate will focus much more heavily on their story rather than any love or romantic undertones, there are plenty, in fact I would argue the majority of visual novels that take Doki Doki literature's route of focusing not on story but exclusively on romantic scenarios. And that's why this quarrel is so interesting. These games usually only focus on creating a love interest, a character that the player can grow attached to and ultimately feel satisfied winning over and being with in the end, typically following a good end. They don't really find places to say things that are much more meaningful outside of that. And there's something special about finding such rich, deep conversation within a game that you didn't really expect it from. The conversation of literature, what meaning is to it, how style can affect it, and if style over substance is an argument worth having, are all very interesting conversations that the player can have with themselves, viewing it through Yuri and Natsuki. That's something more than most visual novels are willing to give. And on top of that, it helps us characterize Natsuki and Yuri not just as love interests, but as people. People with opinions on things that aren't the main character. Opinions on literature, what meaning is, what it means to be sad, happy, and how you can express that, and how it feels to have that expression undermined simply because it's not portrayed in a way that the other enjoys. As Natsuki's layers peel back more and more, we begin to see that there's also an extremely troubled childhood as we get hints towards parental abuse from her father. The fact that she isn't typically fed too often, and that because of this, she needs to value every meal her father makes because it might be her last for an extremely long time. Natsuki is abused, and they don't play this abuse in any way that is meant to be overly traumatic or is meant to exclusively evoke emotion from the player. They play it as a facet of her character, and that is such a sophisticated, deep way to portray abuse. The idea of an abusive father is so easy to turn into a cheap way at gaining sympathy for a character and making the player feel sorry. Doki Doki's Literature Club, however, is not content using it for those means. Within Part A, this whole background narrative is fairly well hidden, as you're only given some minor context clues. In Part B, it is explicitly stated, but that's more so to add to the horror elements and to add on top of Monika's character and how blunt and unlikable she is intended to be at that point. By not using the narrative point of parental abuse as something to shout towards the player in order to gain some sort of false sense of depth, as so many modern television shows seem to be willing to do, it simply ingrains this in Natsuki's character. Her actions make sense when this information is revealed to you or when you finally come to understand it. Everything she's done up until that point lines up with it. This isn't just something tacked on to her to gain sympathy. This is so deeply ingrained within her. Her insistence that the literature club is something important but also not something she wants to ruin by potentially adding new, unsavorable members. The fact that she's so into baking for herself and baking for others shows how, because she at her own home is never fed, values the concept of feeding others and making sure they don't suffer the same fate. Natsuki is a traumatically damaged character. Not a character with trauma, but someone who has been affected by that trauma. And we see the ripples rather than the actual trauma slapped on like some form of sticker. Doki Doki takes that writing concept throughout its entire runtime. Natsuki is not the only character like this, she's simply who I used as my example. Sayuri is the same, where her actions all line up with the reveal of her Great Depression and suicidal tendencies, and is also one of the most brutally honest and completely genuine expressions of depression I've ever seen in literature of any kind. Sayuri's depression and eventual suicide is so realistically grounded, it kind of hurts, as someone who has experienced depression and has seen it in people around him. And it's these pieces of the character that give such life to Doki Doki. Starting off from generic jumping points of tropes and characterizations such as childhood friend and tsundere make the reveal that these characters are so much more lifelike than you ever expected more impactful. It sets you up for a certain mindset and then pulls the rug underneath you. Not only is it greatly effective writing, it sets up that effective writing in a way that makes it more impactful without feeling like it's cheating you or as if it's playing you for a fool and only tugging on your heartstrings meaninglessly. It makes you feel like you're actually getting to know these people. As you spend more time in the literature club, those overly cutesy first impressions you had begin to peel away because, well, realistically, you had made those first impressions just as you had on this game. Your first impression was cute, bubbly, something simple to sink into and waste your time, but in fact, nothing is ever quite like that. The more time you spend with these people, the more you realize they're people. They have issues. They struggle. They aren't always nice. They don't always get along well together. They don't always enjoy each other's company, and they don't all want the same thing from you or from the club that ties them together. This is meaningful, deep writing. This is something that speaks to the player and allows the player to more easily relate to the characters, because these characters become more than the tropes they're established as. They become realistic representations of people in the real world. You may know someone like Natsuki. You may know someone like Yuri. You may even know someone like Sayuri. Or Monica, maybe even. Even though they're so exaggerated due to the nature of visual novels, the tone that the game sets, it never strays too far from that you lose your grounded interest in the story. These characters go through meaningful internal dilemmas, external dilemmas, arguments, etc. And that never makes the horror aspect feel too far away from what you experienced within the first 2 hours of the game. By grounding you so heavily in its characters and how realistic they can be, it makes the horror that comes later more effective. And it makes the writing that you get to experience within the first 2 hours not boring enough to lose your interest. You aren't sitting there tapping your fingers just waiting for the game to become scary. You almost forget the game is supposed to be scary. You almost wish that you could just play the game that Doki Doki sets up for its first 2 hours. I mean, I don't know about you, but the first time I had that drop of Sayuri's death, I knew that this was the path the game was taking, but that didn't stop me from trying to find out if there's some way that I can avoid that. Google searches upon Google searches trying to find if there is some way to just keep going. There's some way to make sure that the game never breaks and I can just keep pretending that I can live a happy life with Natsuki. Of course, the game isn't like that, but the fact that it can set up such a deep emotional response within me that I feel upset because my friend is lost, that's meaningful. And of course, the game isn't like that, and it goes on and becomes just as entertaining, if not more so, and even more daring and interesting. But still, a piece of me wishes there's some way to keep Sayuri happy. Some way to just keep going on with a visual novel that is just a dating sim with deep, meaningful writing. And again, that makes Part B all the more effective because it's not just scaring you, it's reminding you that you don't get to be happy anymore. That whole section of the game you went through, knowing these people, growing accustomed to them, growing comfortable in their space, is gone. You aren't comfortable anymore. You aren't safe anymore. And no matter how much you want that back, this is the game now. This is what Monica has made. And that's not to say that this comes out of nowhere within Part B. Part A does have some very interesting foreshadowing, and I think it's worth mentioning. For example, Natsuki's manga reflects the exact writing approach that Dan takes to the series. Am I on a first-name basis with Dan Savato? I'm on a first-name basis with... what's up, Dan? I'm your boy. Anyways, discussing how the manga begins with seemingly generic tropes, almost no plot, and later as it goes on, reveals that there is a deep, meaningful plot, and that there are subtleties within the characters, recurring patterns and jokes that mean more than originally apparent that Natsuki points out. All this reflects the game itself, and how, yeah, it may seem like there's no plot right now, but you best believe there's gonna be, and you best believe it's gonna catch you off guard. We also have all the foreshadowing within the poems themselves, and did I mention these poems are actually extremely well written? I mean, In a game about poetry and writing poetry, you would hope they would be well written, but these kind of exceeded my expectations, so I'm sorry, I'm getting a little sidetracked here, but I do believe these deserve some praise. I believe Dan Savato wrote them all, as he is the only writing credit. However, these do feel like poems that are all written by 4 distinctly unique people with 4 unique approaches to writing. Natsuki's feels like someone who values simplicity and effectiveness over exuberant writing and flourishes. Yuri's writing feels like someone who values the chase between the reader and the writer, trying to dig deeper to understand the meaning that the writer has so deliberately embellished. Sayuri feels like someone who isn't quite sure what they like, but knows that it's something between happiness and sadness they can't just place their finger on. And Monika's writings all act as foreshadowing towards what she will do in Part B, as they all sort of reveal her epiphany, slowly creeping up on her, as she begins to understand the nature of the game, the nature of the club, and the nature of her own existence. And it's this aspect of foreshadowing that makes Part A so interesting. I've heard some people say that Part A has no foreshadowing, and that makes Part B far less effective than it could have been. And I don't think that's correct. Part A is full of rich foreshadowing towards what the characters are going through and how that means for the story's progression. It's clear when you start to understand what Yuri's going through, or what Natsuki's going through, or what Sayuri's going through, that this game will not stay cheery, and that itself is foreshadowing. In fact, Yuri says herself, stagnating air is a common foreshadowing of bad things to come. The manga foreshadows how the story will come to mean something more than is currently apparent, and Yuri's book, although I didn't play her route, please don't quote me on this, I believe foreshadows the dark twist that will come within the story. As the main character points out, they thought it would be a happy-go-lucky story, but in fact it's something severely dark. Hey, just a little note, editing this, I forgot to mention something that's actually really interesting, and I think this is a good enough spot to just kind of plunk it in. There is a lot of very interesting subversion that happens with the tropes and what the characters are later revealed as. An example of these are Sayuri's typical tendencies to sleep in and be lazy being revealed to actually be symptoms of her depression, as well as Natsuki's overall lolly demeanor and body type being linked directly to her malnourishment due to her father's abuse. Again, just more interesting ways that the game tries to take the original tropes and turn them into something a bit deeper and more three-dimensional rather than flat. Just thought it was worth mentioning. And concluding this whole section, we have the build-up to Part B, which I believe warrants its own little discussion as to how absurdly effective it is. You come to understand now that Sayuri has suffered through her entire life with depression. Severe depression that stops her from being happy, even in scenarios that you believe would lead someone to be happy. For example, Sayuri confesses to you and you're given the decision to claim that she is your best friend or that you love her. Either way, it results in the same outcome. Sayuri says she wants things just to go back to the way they were, and if you promise that you're going to be her best friend just as things always were, she ends up not being happy. And if you say that you love her and will cherish her forever and reciprocate her feelings, she ends up not happy. This sort of sets a feeling of inevitability in the player's stomach, the fact that no matter what they did, even though they think they made the right decision, they probably haven't. And if you choose to move forward with that decision, you don't get the option to go back. Sayuri commits suicide, the game resets, and your saves are gone. You never get the chance to know if choosing the other option would have saved her, and spoiler alert, it doesn't. Leading up to that, the player wakes up, realizes that Sayuri isn't coming to school with him in the morning, is worried, but goes nonetheless, and Monika says something concerning. That she already knows about what happened that last day, about what you said to Sayuri, whatever option you made, and how it affected her. And then you read the poem that she set up to read for that day's cultural festival, and it's something ominous, dark, outside of the character of Sayuri that you've come to know. This causes you to rush to her house, the music cut, this fucking line, it fades to black, you have a slow dilemma between yourself whether you should open the door or not, and then you do. immediately blame yourself. You blame the decisions you made, in fact directly referencing that this is no longer a point you can load back from. If you try to load back, it'll crash the game and reset it back to part B. This entire point of the game is not to make the character of you feel bad, but to make the player you feel bad. To make it feel like this was your fault. You caused this. You made Sayuri commit suicide. It was your decisions, and you could not give to her what she wanted. Even if this was an inevitability, playing through it, you don't know that until you go back at the end of it all and play it through again and realize, oh, it didn't make a difference after all. This is just the route the game takes. But for that moment, you don't know that. You're left blind. You're left believing that the game itself is pointing its finger at you and saying you did this. That pit in your stomach that you're feeling right now because the sickly happy but tragically depressed Sayuri is hanging by the neck, her fingers bloody, demonstrating that she had a change of heart as she choked out slowly. That's your pit. You made that pit and it sits in your stomach and you live with that. It guilts the player, and moving forward the game will play on that guilt. Play on the fact that this is your fault, that you made this happen, till part C reveals that in fact you didn't. But still, it's that guilt that makes this game so effective and is its first glimpse into the meta-narrative that it portrays. This isn't just a game that's out to scare the character or out to make the character feel bad. This is a game that's out to scare you. It's meant to make you feel attacked. Hence, all the warnings at the beginning. Well, now they make sense. This isn't just a game that has triggering content. This is a game that blames that content on you. This is a game that infests your files, attacks your system, reads off of it, and tries to get into your head. And moving forward, we'll see how effective that horror is due to the setup that Part A has. Now let's discuss Part B, and this is where things get a little bit more fun, I guess. That's kind of weird to say, but it's true. Part B works as a rerun of everything you just went through, however minus Sayuri, and so the plot takes a little bit of a twist, this time being Monica that introduces you to Literature Club and Yuri being the vice president instead. This strangeness and uncertainty that comes from everything being a little bit off is something that's carried all the way through Part B and made very clear within the first few seconds of it, with graphical glitches and the structure of the story changing randomly. You feel off kilter, you feel unsettled because it's sort of right but not quite, and it's played so straight by the characters within the world, very rarely ever directly referenced, that it makes you feel like maybe you're just going insane. I mean, you know you're not. You know you signed up for a horror game and this is this game's form of horror, but still, it's a pretty effective way of portraying that horror, making the player feel themselves deranged, while the characters around them are in fact the deranged ones, just so obliviously unaware. This section not only utilizes what you've grown accustomed to subvert that and better scare you, but it also uses all your safety nets against you. It strips away your saves and your loads many times throughout, making you feel as if however you progress is how you progress, and you're locked into this hellish nightmare zone. It will play around with the positioning of characters in ways that you never thought a visual novel would play around with, and makes even decision-making something to be scared of, as it strips away your control over the only thing you had control over, the path of the story, forcing your cursor to push down towards Monica and not allowing you to select any other character, making the decision between Natsuki and Yuri be slowly zoomed in upon until Monica pops up and asks if you want to just step outside for a bit, forcing you to spend time with her. It makes the player feel stripped of control, and as if the entire game is being puppeteered by the only other person the fingers seem to be pointing towards, Monica. We also begin to understand the characters a bit more richer, as their previous underlying psychological hang-ups are pointed out a bit more explicitly. References towards Natsuki's hunger and her having to resort to fishing for change underneath vending machines just to feed herself. References to Yuri's self-harm and how they may not be linked to depression, but something far more severely unhinged, possibly even being sexual in nature, and her overall obsessive behavior becoming more and more apparent. This understanding makes us backtrack to what we learned in Part A, and apply that to them. Even though we understand this is extremely blown out of proportions and far from anything Part A ever would have attempted to tackle had it progressed further, it still makes us understand just how deep these scars of the characters we've come accustomed to are. It makes us understand how deranged Yuri is and how in pain Natsuki is. And again, this is not just effective horror, it's effective narrative, as it makes us wish that we could go back to Part A, where Natsuki wasn't forced to being berated constantly by Yuri to the point of tears and such low, aggressive jabs it can make anyone crack. Or go back to a time when Yuri wasn't this deranged and unhinged and scared of herself because of her behavior. A time when Sayuri wasn't gone, not just dead, but wiped from the game, her existence completely overridden, making it feel like you are the only person that can remember her in this twisted area that you found yourself in. Part B is also littered with extremely interesting set pieces, though some of the most memorable portions of the game exist within Part B, specifically hinging upon certain scares. The scares in this game are so effective because they not only play off of what has been established in Part A and the expectations that you had going in being completely subverted by increasingly darker and darker situations and characterizations, but they're also so effective because they play off of your own feelings of safety. Like I said in the beginning, there's some expected pieces of visual novels that are subverted in this. You're expected to be able to save and load at any moment that you wish. You're expected to read back the history and find exactly what is stated before, not something totally different. You're expected to use the skip function to skip forward through text you've already read, not to skip forward multiple days as you watch a corpse slowly deteriorate in front of you. Even things so heavily ingrained in us by previous visual novels or the first 2 hours that we never thought they could ever be subverted for horror, such as the fact that, of course, the text box in the text is layered over top the background and the characters. But no, not even in that assumption are you safe. Even playing with time manipulation, making you feel like you're going truly insane by reversing something you just saw, acting as if it didn't happen, making you question if you saw it at all. It's all extremely effective psychological horror that is only possible through the game's own system. And that's what makes Part B so unique. It expresses horror that cannot be expressed in any other way. How many horror games can you find that are simply first-person view of a darkly lit area, a monster chases you, and you hide from them? It seems that we've almost become flooded with the same typical horror fares, especially from indie developers, which is the one place you would expect these games to be the most unique. Not to get off track, but ironically enough, one of the most unique horror games in a long time was Resident Evil 7, a AAA title, while Outlast 2 fell flat on its face for how generic and simply boring it was. However, here we have an example of truly unique, independently developed horror. This is horror that can only exist in Doki Doki because it uses its own functions and its own gameplay as the source of the horror. You can't take the scares that exist in this game and apply it to any other game because they would be far less effective, some of them not even physically possible, such as having to use the skip function to skip through Yuri's suicide, having the more horrific lines of text be in a totally different font, almost conditioning you to fear that font. The game conditions you to fear a font. That's unique. These are scares that can only exist within the framework of a visual novel. And as we see near the end of Part B, as Monica erases the other two characters and locks you into what I will describe as Part C, Monica's room, you begin to understand that this is a game that is willing to go so far into the boundaries of horror, you're not really sure where it can go from here. Part C is commonly referred to as the room, and justly so, as this section of the game exists almost entirely within this one room with Monica. Monica explains how she's gone into the game's coding and files themselves and erased everything but that room and her. She explains how she became self-aware through her position as leader of the literature club, aware that she didn't have a root, that she was simply a character to facilitate discussion and to create narrative functions such as leading people towards the culture festival. She was not a love interest, and yet she fell in love with you, the player. She explains how painful that is to have love that the game will simply not allow to be fulfilled, while she's forced to sit on the sidelines, and no matter what she does or what she changes, every other character does get to fulfill it. And so the only option for her in order to get a chance was to completely remove those portions of the game, leaving only her. This is strange. This is something media hasn't really attempted before. As you're left in this room, only staring blankly at Monika, in 30-second intervals, she will strike up conversation with you about anything. And she explains to you that this is it. This is the game now. Whenever you're feeling lonely or sad or upset, you click on that little icon, you launch Literature Club, and you talk to Monika in her room for as long as you need about whatever happens to cross her mind. It's almost a comforting thought. You understand all the horrible things she's done. She's pressured all of the characters in the games to do terrible things, kill themselves, violently outburst, be stuck in horribly depressive, angry episodes, and eventually just erase them all because in her mind, they aren't real. You and her are the only real people, because you and her are the only people that have control over this game. And yet, there's something comforting about the idea that you can come back here anytime you want, listen to the ominous but ultimately relaxing music, and chat. In fact, she even has a Twitter, and all of her tweets are surprisingly very uplifting and happy. She mentions how she's upset that she never got to wear anything outside of school uniform because the game never had a route for her. Instead, she was locked into the room, never being able to see you outside of class. And how she wishes, if you knew any artists, they could maybe draw her in something outside of school uniform. Keep it PG though, she mentions. It's these little pieces that add so much to her character, and the fact that you are here as long as you want. You get to know Monika as much as you want to know Monika. If you care enough about her, you can sit there and you can listen to her talk. You can learn that she's not scared of death anymore. She thinks that maybe there is a god, and she's also a vegetarian. You can learn whatever you want about her. It almost seems to go on forever. I had a friend who spent almost 2 hours in that room, just listening to her. That's an oddly unique experience for a game. The ability to know a character as much as you want to know them. It almost makes Monika feel too real. Oftentimes, narratives are given to you. The creator of the story meticulously plans out their story. A book is as long as a book is. It has the contents that the creator wrote into it, and that's it. You can make assumptions, you can guess, and you can hypothesize what exists outside of that and what it alludes to, but ultimately what is contained within those pages is it. You know the characters as much as those pages allow. You know the characters as much as the creator allows you to know them. You understand the story of a game as much as the game allows you to understand it. But this is the first time where you're given control. This is the first time I've ever seen a game give you such deep control over how much you know. For the first time in my gaming experience, I wasn't just fed a character as much as the creator wanted me to know them. I got to know Monika as much as I wanted to know Monika, and that's an oddly intimate relationship to have with a sprite. It makes your relationship with Monika feel real. You aren't just being fed something, you're giving back. You're looking into it as much as you want to look into it. You're having an exchange, like a real relationship. And how you get out of this is as unique as it is itself. You have to go into the game files and delete Monika's character file, as she did for all the other characters. And in this little last bout of her life, we see that you've done it again. The game blames you again. You're hurting Monika. You got to know her as much as you wanted to know her, and you're hurting her because you're deleting her. And why? Because you don't want to spend time with her anymore. The only reason you have to delete Monika is to continue through the game. The 20 minutes and credits that the game has left in it. You're making a conscious choice, saying, I'm done with you, Monika. I want out. And it hurts her. It hurts her physically and emotionally, and she lashes out at you because of this pain, because unlike Sayuri's suicide, this is directly because of your actions. You could have left Monika be, you could have spent time with her, you could have made her happy, and you choose to not. You choose to deny her happiness, you choose to deny her life, and she accepts that, says she still loves you, and moves on. Monika's relationship with the player is almost scary, and how intimately real it feels by the end of the story. And so the next part begins. You restart the game, Monika's gone, Sayuri's back. You play through the beginning, minus Monika, now with Sayuri as the literature club leader. And this part of the game, again, is cheery and happy, like the beginning of part A was, but more so. And you can't help but feel like after everything you've gone through, that's more of a stab than it is a saving grace. This is it. This is the perfect outcome. Every action taken by your player is so much more caring and thoughtful than it was in the beginning. In part A, you seem passive to the idea of the literature club, only really joining because there's a cute girl, and in part B, you only join because Monika mentions there's a girl there that likes manga and anime. They're self-centered decisions that are perfectly fine and well written, but in part C, you join the club because you want to surprise Sayuri and make her happy. You've already made the decision to join the literature club. You don't have to be coaxed into it because it's what would make Sayuri the most happy. That's a touching, heartfelt thing for your character to do. Every character seems happy. Natsuki and Yuri get along extremely well. Even though they butt heads a little bit, they ultimately come to a compromise. That they want to learn more about each other and understand each other better, and so they will indulge in each other's pastimes, Natsuki reading a book and Yuri reading manga. In fact, they even plan out a date to go out together and pick out books for each other. This is the happiest section of Doki Doki Literature Club, and it stings all that much more because of everything that has happened before it and what will soon happen after. Monika has already implanted in your head the idea that these are not people. These are not actual people like she is. Monika's already implanted in your head that you and her are the only real people. Monika's relationship with you at this point is the most intimate, the most meaningful, because it is portrayed as the closest to reality, while the others are described as simply characters, programmed to do what they're doing, programmed to always lead to an inevitable ending, falling in love with you, completely devoid of free will. They're fake. That bittersweet feeling you have as you play through this section is due to that. It's due to the understanding that this isn't really real, and that you destroyed the closest thing you had to a real 3D relationship in this game. And just as that realization has the time to sink in, Monika's back. Sayuri mentions that she knows. She knows everything because she is now the literature club leader. She knows about everything you did. She knows about everything Monika did. And Monika, still somewhere in the game, just as all of them were still somewhere in the game, not fully deleted, comes back and erases everything. Because that's her epiphany. The epiphany that there is no happiness. That the literature club is simply there to cause pain. Her becoming aware of the fact that this is a game and you are a player, and that every single piece of the game is pointing towards others falling in love with you and not her, is what led Monika to such destructive, obsessive, painfully driven actions. And Monika comes to the realization that the same will happen to Sayuri. Sayuri will go through the same pain that Monika went through. Everyone will go through all the same pain. The game is a cycle. Monika is not the mastermind, but instead the game itself is the mastermind. Everything that happened is not because Monika became self-aware, but because anyone could have been in that place. Anyone could have become self-aware, and anyone would have lashed out like that, of all the characters in the game. And so she makes the ultimate decision to wipe the game completely, leaving you with the credits. And so you're left to watch the credits roll as everything is slowly wiped away, saving Monika and her friends from the same miserable fate you just witnessed. And in the first instance of voiced lines in the game, Monika sings you a moving song of unrequited love.
Every day I imagine a future where I can be with you. In my hand is a pen that will write a poem of me and you. The ink falls down into a dark puddle. Just move your hand right the way into his heart. But in this world of infinite choices, what will it take just to find that special day? What will it take just to find that special day?
Doki Doki is a bleak and depressing game, but it is not entirely devoid of uplifting sentiments. In its brief runtime, it manages to create characters deeper and more realistic than most visual novels can do in 60 hours. Its unique take on horror is genuinely scary and entertaining, but I find that the main draw for me is the complexity and depth of the writing within the game, and I really don't see that aspect being given nearly enough credit. Doki Doki Literature Club is a game that scared me, made me feel warm and at home, and ultimately moved me to tears in a short 5-hour span. And that's why I'm writing this love letter to it. Thank you, Dan Salvato, for creating a truly unique experience and giving the world the gift that is Natsuki. And thank you all members of the Literature Club. I won't be forgetting you anytime soon. And remember, just Monica.